Hello everyone. Finally got a day where I can come out in the middle of nowhere and get some silence so that I can do these videos. I've been mentioning that I'm going to start covering a series on sexual violence for the trans and non-binary communities. The information that is going to be given throughout this series, which is probably going to be quite a few videos, honestly, it still applies to those who are not trans or not non-binary as far as the resources and stuff go. I think somewhere in this series, when I give the list of all the resources and stuff, there's only like 2 or maybe 3 that is trans specific. The rest of the resources and stuff that I have gathered for this series is anybody. It can be man, it can be woman, non-binary, trans. It doesn't matter your identity or your sexuality in order for you to reach out and access those services. I will make note of specific LGBTQIA plus resources. So, sexual violence against the queer and trans communities. We need to begin with understanding the issue. It is important to recognize that sexual violence and intimate partner violence are about the power and control. So, identities that hold less power or privilege in our society are often more targeted with these forms of violence. In keeping with this, the rate of sexual assault is higher against queer and transgender communities and anyone holding one or more identities that experience marginalization, including bi or pansexual folks, indigenous or two-spirit, racialized communities, and people with disabilities. It is also important to remember that labels and statistics often don't accurately reflect the complexities. Trans and non-binary people are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience sexual assault. Bisexual people are also 2 to 3 times more likely to experience sexual assault. Gay men are 2 times more likely to experience sexual assault. The only person responsible for sexual assault is the person who chooses to harm. In addition to sexual and intimate partner violence in relationships, queer and trans communities are often the target of sexual violence and or marginalization by others because of homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, misogyny, and other forms of discrimination. This can create barriers to accessing support too. Biases and normative assumptions about genders and experiences can make it more difficult for people to get the support that they need. Trans, two-spirit, and non-binary folks may also be unable to access needed services due to barriers in gender-segregated services, or the lack of knowledge and competency about trans care from professionals. People are the experts in their own experiences. If you are supporting someone who has experienced sexual violence, the most important things that you can do are to listen without judgment or assumptions, support whatever they choose to do and how they choose to do it, and believe them. No matter who you are or who you might be supporting, it is important to understand the connections between gender and sexuality, bias, and sexual violence. Prejudices, misconceptions, and general ideas around gender and sexuality can have an impact on experiences of sexual violence. It is important to understand the ways homophobia and transphobia can inform experiences of sexual violence because these impact the way others respond by providing or withholding support. These biases are present when people assume the gender of the person who used offending behavior, or assume the sexuality of the person who experienced harm because of who their offender was. Biases create barriers and keep people from feeling safe when accepting or accessing support services. Queer and trans people are disproportionately targeted by people who harm with sexual violence and often experience additional harm through homophobia and or transphobia in their experiences of sexual violence. At the same time, it's not only cis LGBTQIA plus individuals who are harmed by these additional forms of violence. When it comes to sexual assault or abuse, straight and cis people are sometimes harmed by someone of the same gender and can experience bias or prejudice when disclosing about their abuse. It is also important to recognize that often people who harm someone of the same gender are themselves heterosexual. Sexual assault has nothing to do with sexual preference. Committing sexual assault or abuse is motivated by a wish to assert power and control over another person. This motivation explains why it is the people who are considered the most vulnerable or marginalized in our society, including cis LGBTQ plus individuals, who are disproportionately targeted with this form of violence. While there is a persistent myth or assumption that these things will line up with a sexual preference, sexual violence is not about sexual attraction or sexual orientation. A person who experienced sexual violence has experienced a trauma that has nothing to do with their sexual or romantic attractions. Sexual violence is about power and control. A defining quality of sex is that it needs to be consensual. Any sexual activity that is not consensual is no longer sex. It is sexual assault or abuse. Consent is clear, voluntary, mutual, enthusiastic, ongoing, and act-specific and sober. Sexual assault is not actually about sex. It's about power and control. You're going to hear me say that a lot throughout this series. Now we're on to control. When someone uses sexual language, imagery, body parts, and or contact to harm another person, they are denying that person the ability to set their own sexual boundaries and decide what happens to their body. Denying someone the right to make decisions over their own body and boundaries is an act of control. Whether or not the person causing harm experienced pleasure or was intentional in causing harm does not influence whether or not it was in fact sexual violence. Example: if someone uses a baseball bat to hit someone over the head, you would not call it playing baseball. If someone uses sexual contact to sexually assault someone, that should not be called sex. Power. Sexual violence happens when power is used to coerce, pressure, deceive, intimidate, manipulate, blackmail, and or guilt, or to physically force a person in order to restrict their ability to control their body. Forms of power include using a relationship dynamic or feelings to pressure, guilt, or manipulate someone. Example: a partner saying, "If you loved me, you would have sex with me." Using popularity or relationships to others to pressure someone to engage in sexual activity. Example: threatening to spread rumors about a person if they do not engage in sexual acts. Using physical force to compromise someone's ability to physically control their body. Using someone's financial circumstances to influence them. Example, a landlord insisting on sexual contact to cover overdue rent with the threat of eviction. Using religious or spiritual belief to guilt or manipulate someone. Example, a partner saying, "We are married. It is your duty to have sex with me." Bodies respond instinctively. This is something that a couple of weeks ago I was actually helping a trans woman write up her police report because her body responded and the perpetrator kept telling her that she wanted it when she didn't. So when she filed the police report, they weren't really going to pursue it. It was basically his word against her word, and since her body responded and there was some pictures that was taken and like a whole mess of stuff going on, they didn't want to prosecute the case. So I helped her file another report and included the statistics and a whole bunch of information. But anyway, at the end of that report, the DA decided to go ahead and prosecute. So I don't know, maybe a few months before she actually sees a courtroom, but at least there was that. So even if the body does respond, it is okay to go ahead and file reports. It might, like in her situation, cause it to where you got to fight just a little bit harder, unfortunately. But it's worth the fight to get the part behind bars. Sexual violence can feel confusing for those who have experienced harm because bodies often respond to violence in unexpected ways. When our nerves are engaged by the senses, see, hear, smell, taste, or feel, they will respond instinctively. This response might be opposite to how a person feels about what is happening to their body. For this reason, during sexual violence, an erection, natural lubrication, and orgasm may all occur. None of these physical body responses are an indication that the person wanted or enjoyed what happened. I could literally repeat that little paragraph 1,000 times over because I hear it so much that people don't want to file because of this and this and this. So how does gender connect to sexual violence? People of all gender identities can experience sexual violence, and they can all cause harm using sexual violence. However, people who are trans and non-binary are harmed by sexual violence at rates that are disproportionately high compared to people who are cis. While studies have constantly shown sexual violence happens more often against trans and non-binary people, a barrier in bringing attention to this issue comes from the bias that can be reflected in the studies themselves. Many of the studies only have the options for female and male. When asking about gender, and people who don't fit into one of these two categories are either put into a gender category that does not reflect their identity or even removed from the study entirely. What we know is that the number is higher because sexual violence is an abuse of power in the system that marginalizes anyone who does not fit the boundaries that are centered: straight, cis, white, able-bodied, man, and so on. Sexual violence can be additionally impactful for people who are trans and non-binary for a number of reasons. The violence may be an act of transphobia. It may increase gender dysphoria, may feel unsafe, There may be new or heightened fears of openly identifying as trans or non-binary. Reporting to the police may be unsafe. Despite being targeted for violence at such high rates, trans and non-binary individuals are provided fewer social supports. As well, the supports that do exist can be unsafe to access due to the lack of provider knowledge, transphobia, misgendering, gendering of services, and inaccessible spaces. Trans and non-binary individuals who experience sexual violence need and deserve more services that uphold their experiences as deserving of belief and care. There are, fortunately, a number of services throughout the states that do provide services for trans and non-binary folk. Sexual violence can also be experienced and inflicted by people of all sexual orientations. The sexual orientation of the person who experienced harm cannot be assumed by the gender or sexual orientation of the person who harmed them. As I've covered, sexual violence happens between people of all genders and sexual orientations and has nothing to do with romantic or sexual attraction. While this is true, sometimes after experiencing sexual violence, people have questions and worries about what the gender or sexual orientation of the person who harmed them means about their own gender or sexual orientation. It is important to know that their own gender or sexual orientation has nothing to do with it. There is no definitive or proven impact of sexual violence on sexual orientation or gender. Sexual violence does not compromise your sexual orientation or your gender identity. There can be additional barriers for accessing support if someone fears that their sexual orientation or gender identity are compromised or questions the validity of their experience because of the gender or sexual orientation of the person who harmed them. All people who experience sexual violence are deserving of support. The gender and sexual orientation of the person who harmed them does not change that. Questions about identity after experiencing sexual violence are not uncommon. It is valid to want to explore these questions, and counseling can be one way of doing that. If someone discloses that they were sexually assaulted or abused, do not make assumptions. Listen, believe what the person is telling you about their experience, and find ways to support them. I'll do a video on how to support kids and adults as well as bystanders who witness something for whenever they disclose to you. Don't assume the person's sexual orientation or that their gender, and don't make those assumptions about the person who sexually assaulted them. By using neutral language until you hear what language to use from the person you are supporting, and letting them take the lead and telling you only what they feel comfortable disclosing, you are letting them take the lead and have the control over their own experience and story. A simple yet powerful way for someone who has experienced sexual violence to regain or assert their own boundaries and will. You are also letting them know that you are leaving space for whatever their experience might have been, and this can help people to feel safer about not being judged. Another powerful way to be an ally to people of all genders and sexualities who have experienced sexual violence and in general is to stay aware of these issues and hold others accountable for their problematic language, assumptions, or behaviors when you witness them. It is important that you feel safe to do so, but even small interruptions can make a difference. Things like explaining what you find problematic, telling someone it's not funny, deflecting or shifting their attention to separate them from someone being harmed, or even just not laughing at or validating a comment can all let someone know that you don't support the way of thinking or behavior. Stay safe, everybody.